Hello and welcome back to
The Mentors.
This is Vadim,
And Sergey.
and this is a podcast about what's actually happening inside modern businesses, the talent decisions, the skills gaps, and the new rules no one says out loud.
The Mentors rebooted. Would that be the right way to reintroduce ourselves to our community of listeners? Thank you so much for tuning in again after quite a while. I think we're long overdue to catch our listeners up.
And we think this is a really timely time for us to
But he was very eloquent today.
timely time for us to restart the conversation with you all, because it feels like there's more uncertainty than ever before in terms of what's going on with hiring markets, what's going on within businesses, how are they operating, how are they making business decisions, hiring decisions, talent decisions, investment decisions. And so our job has always been to uncover the truth behind how world-class organizations are built and evolve. And we thought, since we're talking to so many industry professionals all the time, it is our duty to bring that back into the conversation today and provide these very, very relevant and timely insights. So,
And we're always real with you. You know that. We're always real, and that is what we want to continue bringing to our audience here based on the real conversations that we're having every single day. So I think, why don't we catch up, folks, a little bit to what we've been up to over the last couple of years since we did our last recording. It took us a while to get back into the recording booth, but here we are.
yeah. So it's been, I think, 4 years since our last episode. So a lot has happened in those 4 years. We started an ed tech company called School 16. We graduated 500 students. With our Future of Work programs, we have partnered with top business schools across the country. And I think more importantly than ever before, we've started to spend a lot more time thinking about what does the future look like of work, of education, as these new technologies come into the market. Now, there's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of posturing, a lot of content that algorithms bring up to the fold that make us feel, quite frankly, like crap. And so this podcast is designed to actually show you what's actually going on in these markets.
Yes, that is right. That is right. I think we did a couple of episodes after we launched the company with Free Code Camp and with the founder of that medical device company.
Levels Health, former
Levels Health.
SpaceX engineer.
Yeah, and then we kind of fell off because we got really busy with the business. We moved to Mexico City, so ya hablamos español.
Por favor,
Entonces,
si quieren practicar con nosotros,
yes, practice
estamos
with us.
intentando mejorar nuestro acento y
Look at Vadim.
vocabulario, todo.
Vadim's such a spicy Latina here
Chilango.
with his accent. So do leave comments in Spanish. We welcome our Spanish-speaking listeners, both in the U.S. and abroad. Maybe one day we'll be confident enough to do a whole episode in Spanish, but that is a big life update that we wanted to share with you all, and we'll share some stories as you listen to this podcast with what that experience has been like, how it's opened up our mind, our lives, and our worlds, and how we'll hopefully impart that on you.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are thinking about how to design a lifestyle that sort of meets today's reality in terms of many cities being unaffordable to live in, salaries not really matching inflation, and all the like. And so there are other ways to build a lifestyle. And we hope that part of our experience and what we've done over the last 4 years here in Ciudad de Mexico and Mexico and the like can shed some light into what could be options for you as well. But today's episode and the topic of today's discussion is really to help pull back the curtain a little bit in terms of what people are seeing online and what we're hearing in the market and talking to industry professionals. And more specifically, I think if you're spending any time on social media, your people online will make you feel like if you're not using 27 different AI tools and automating your life and automating every single part of your job, your career is over. Meanwhile, the VPs and CEOs and leaders that we're talking to talk about how they're desperate to find even one person who can think clearly and build simple solutions for their business problems. In other words, what we're hearing is not much has changed.
That's true. That is true. We're going to get into what we're hearing, and the motivation for this episode and for the work that we've done in the last couple of weeks. I have interviewed 14 company CEOs and VPs over the last couple of weeks. The motivation came from, yet again, logging into LinkedIn, seeing a bunch of posts back to back about how amazing AI is and how it's doing all these things that are going to replace humans, and you better pay attention. Feeling super depressed, hitting an X, logging out as fast as I can, and deciding, why don't I talk to some humans the good old-fashioned way, like we were born and bred to do.
Yeah, that's true. And you know what? Honestly, it's refreshing to get on these calls where you're in private conversations. You're not exposed to how people are going to judge what you say online. And people are really sharing unfiltered feedback into what they're seeing. So maybe we can start there, Sergey. I know you've talked to a bunch of different types of folks, both operators and leaders of departments and then leaders of companies as well. But the one question that comes to mind for me is, what are you hearing from them in terms of actual use cases for where they may have a particular person within the team that is actually the ideal version of what they believe they would want to have 10 people of, in terms of how they're executing within their role? What does that look like?
So the actual use cases. Well, before I answer that question, I have to call out, probably a lot of you have heard about this 60-minute interview that just came out yesterday. Anderson Cooper was interviewing the CEO of Anthropic, the company with one of the famous AI models out there, Claude, that a lot of people use. It's if you don't use ChatGPT, you probably use Claude, or you probably use both. Yep. And that guy wrote back in the spring that 50% of entry-level jobs might be gone within 1 to 5 years. He's adjusted his data a little bit here, and on that 60 Minutes episode said 10 to 20% of entry-level jobs might be gone. So that begs the question of, well, what are we supposed to do to stand out? And what is actually happening in these companies? So first of all, to answer your question, the one thing that I've heard when I got on the phone with pretty much every single one of these people is that the stuff you're hearing on LinkedIn is kind of, for the most part, BS. Okay, they don't have 100 agents out there doing all these jobs that they're not hiring for anymore. Does that mean that there's no implications in the real world in terms of hiring? We'll talk about that a little bit later. But no, agents are not doing everything themselves. So what are some of the use cases? Well, the use cases depend on the company, but the commonality is these leaders, these CEOs, want people who are going to roll up their sleeves and go through the difficult problems of actually watching the tutorials, watching the YouTube videos, going into OpenAI Enterprise and looking into how to plug in your API with other different tools out there to automate your workflows and solving each workflow at a time, right? They're not hiring workflow experts on GTM to come in as a consultant and fix a problem for them, which maybe some of them have, and then they got burned and it didn't work. Yeah. They want that hustler on the inside who's going to go and figure it out and solve the problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's something else, sort of a pattern that I noticed within our conversations as well, is that a lot of the definitive statements about the future of work are already being kind of rolled back and pulled back and redefined and reshaped, because the reality of how this technology actually creates efficiency in the workplace is messier. A lot of the stuff is really messy, and most tech takes a while to get right. Okay, so it's not that there are no efficiencies, it's that very much so the gap in the market is that you need humans that understand how to actually go through the difficult process of creating these efficiencies depending on the use case that they're working within. And one thing that stood out to me, we were in a conversation with a marketing leader within a large company, I think over 1,000 employees. And there's two things that she said. Number one, the management layer, or i.e. people that are just managers, are going away. In the long run, they're going away. And that she, as the leader of her department, even she as the leader of her relatively large department, has to do builder work, has to do individual contributor level work. Another thing that she said, which I think is related, is if you're not technical, it's really hard to survive. Now, there was a nuance there, which is she didn't mean that you have to go out and learn how to code. But what do you think she meant by that then? If you're not going to be a coder, and yet at the same time you're expected to be more technical, what does that actually mean?
I think that she meant that you have to be comfortable enough with the language of technology to, first of all, tell the technology what to do, but then go out and use different tools to solve problems. Whereas before, you may have had technical people setting up the software infrastructure in your company. Now, companies want to rely less and less on engineers to solve problems and have these individual, experts within teams, such as the sales team or the marketing team, go out there, figure out this is how I use 2 or 3 different tools. This is how I have these APIs working together. This is how I have Zapier connected to this tool. And then I can do the testing process end to end to solve the particular problem. So technical enough to understand the language, but yeah, you're not going in there and writing the code. You're just putting pieces of the puzzle together, which means you do have to go through that process of learning how they work. And I actually talked to one individual who did this in his startup. He was trying to solve a particular go-to-market workflow for automating how content is created and divided up and posted on social media. Okay, Took him about 40 hours of digging 1 week. That's an entire week, and I think he actually spread it out over a couple of weeks, but about 40 hours total of digging through documentation, even OpenAI documentation, which changes every week. Watching videos, going on these different influencers and asking them to send him resources for free, and then trying it, applying it to solve the actual problem, right? So it is going through that actual difficult process, not being afraid to solve the problem, not waiting for your boss to tell you this is what you do, A, B, C, now go do it, but actually going through that difficult process yourself.
Yeah. And I think this is actually great news for people that are sort of insatiable learners, because in the end of the day, most talent out there is just not very good. And I think for a long time, folks have been able to get away with pushing off responsibilities to others within the organization, or get away with playing politics really well within an organization. But increasingly, as companies look to make more efficiencies, they're going to be letting go people like that, getting rid of people like that. And so if you are somebody that is hungry to learn, is inherently interested and motivated by figuring out messy stuff, right? Being a builder in that way, you're going to stand out. It's not going to take that much for you to stand out because there's so little talent out there like it.
Really quickly, that VP of marketing with 30 or 40 people that has some managers working under her, I asked her, like, what's going to happen to those people? Are they just bad employees? And she said, no, they are hardworking employees. They're just not, they're not taking these technologies seriously. They're not willing to adapt, right? They're not willing to implement them into their workflow. And she has a mandate from the CEO to implement these tools in the day-to-day work because, look, CEOs believe that they can squeeze efficiency out of these tools. So whether the tools can do everything that you read on LinkedIn that they say they can do with agents and automations, probably not quite true, but they do create efficiencies in the workplace. And you need to be able to show to your employer how you're leveraging these tools beyond just prompting, right? Which everybody should be able to do.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things that she said explicitly. She said, first of all, my entire team is organized by workflows. So obviously the systems thinker. And increasingly as leaders, you have to think in that way. Yeah, you have to understand finance and P&L and the like. You also have to understand workflows and systems. But she said she has ops infrastructure, content teams, etc. Everybody is building something. And she drove the point home even more. She said, I'm eliminating the people who add complexity and don't build anything. So simply put, if you're coming to others with problems and without an actual solution, or at least having tested something, you're just not going to be seen as valuable. Why deal with that when you can work with people that are going to be very direct in terms of actually showing you what they could do and showing you a path to a solution? So this is definitely one thread that we're hearing over and over again. Something else I think that was really interesting that she said, I'm going to touch on in terms of everyone's going to have a revenue goal now. Okay, but before we do that, just to finish up the other thread. Can we give an example to our audience of how we did this when we started off our careers, actually being solution oriented, relatively young, where you're not sure, should I ask for permission? Should I try this thing out? Should I wait to be told exactly what to do? I think me and you did something really unique in our first roles when we were in finance. And again, this was when? 18, 17 years ago? So nothing has changed. But I think this is a really good anecdote for folks.
It's a good parallel. Look, Vadim and I started off, as many of you know, in finance. Something not very glamorous in the finance world called back office finance. What does that mean? Yeah, you don't need to know. Google it and then just erase it from your memory banks forever. But the point is, it's the kind of dirty work you do in the background to move money around. Really, is what it is. A lot of Excel. So, what are the parallels? Coming into that job, and we were, coming directly from undergrad, there was an expectation that you have basic knowledge of Excel. And so everybody in the company had to come in and or demonstrate the ability to learn Excel pretty quickly. Yep. The reality of what happened in this about 200-person company is that from the junior 22-year-old to the senior, people in their 40s and 50s who'd been in a company for a long time, there was actually very few people using Excel to its full capabilities. And so I think you had a similar revelation, sitting in my job day to day, where I had about 3 hours of really manual work that had to happen in Excel to calculate interest rates, to move things from one spreadsheet to another. I don't even remember any more of the details of that work. But I thought, this is crazy. This is way too manual. Why isn't a computer doing this? Why are they asking me to do this work and all these other young people are doing all this work super manually? And so what I did is I spent about a week every day for about half an hour researching how to use macros, which are essentially a way to give instructions in Excel to the system where you can build workflows and push a button and then it does the different steps in the workflow. So build macros. I watched a couple of videos and I read some blog posts about it, and then I implemented it one at a time, to the point where after a few weeks, I was able to come in the morning, get my coffee, push a button, and 15 minutes later, the work would be done while I spent the rest of the day looking for other jobs. Yeah. That's actually what I did. And looking at motorcycles to buy, I think I wanted at the time. Yeah. Did you have a similar experience?
I had the same exact experience at that job, but I'll give you another example because I had a sales job right after this finance job. And in that sales job, we had to, as sales professionals at the time, we were account executives, we had to do everything from prospecting and finding leads to actually getting them, setting appointments, and closing the deal and negotiating the terms of the deal. So it was small business sales, a quota of about $12,000 per month is what I ended up with. And I remember just that most of the sales professionals I worked with all did the same thing, prospecting for new leads. And one thing I learned from this guy that was kind of my mentor is that, a good way to try to find a new business we sold to new businesses like law firms is to see if somebody registered a new domain. And that's it. And so what most people were doing were manually looking up new domains that were registered. And what ended up happening is that everybody did the same thing, and eventually it was kind of like a first come, first serve race to who can get those same leads, and the process stopped working. And so I did something super simple. I was able to, just through some online research, find a couple of directories that were publishing full lists of newly registered domains in the morning at 5 a.m. And then I created an Excel macro that went through those domains and really quickly, based on keywords, would find all the ones that are legal or all the ones that are dentists and the like. And so I would then come into the office with hundreds of leads while people are manually searching lead by lead. And my manager noticed this, and he actually asked me to train everybody else on how to do it. So it ended up being something that others we're able to replicate within the organization. But the most important thing here is that just by spending a little bit more extra effort and doing something that maybe for others seemed a little scary, a little bit more technical. And again, remember, I'm not technical, but I'm just willing to do the research, figure out how to hook things up. That then made me seem like an expert within the company and elevated me to train others to do it. So I think that's what these leaders and organizations are looking for, of that more of that type of mentality of, I'm going to hunt and figure out the solution and implement it, because most people are not willing to do it.
I remember a week after I implemented these macros, I had the CFO of the company email me saying, Sergey, you're the Excel guru here. Can you show me how to do something? And called me into his office. And that way I built a close relationship with the CFO. But I just remember, I was 22, right? 23 at the time, thinking, this is hilarious, because I didn't spend that much time. Like, I don't even think it was 40 hours total figuring out how to do these macros. It was like half an hour, 45 minutes here, half an hour, 45 minutes there. And all of a sudden, people already saw me as an Excel guru. So this is a perfect example of, especially if you're in a non-tech industry, you can make yourself be seen as an expert very quickly by digging a little bit deeper than other people are. And if you are in the tech industry, well, it might take a little bit more work, a little bit more focus, but it's par for the course. This is what's going to make people actually competitive and defensible in the workplace, I think, because these tools are easier and easier to learn how to use. And, with different platforms out there like YouTube, you can learn very, very quickly.
And what I'll say as well is, again, don't get discouraged or unmotivated if you think that this isn't an actual differentiated skill set. The reality with most people that we've talked to, the reality is that most talent is either incapable or unwilling to do this. So even though on LinkedIn you might see people saying that they're all doing this, well, most of them are not. So you will 100% stand out.
Let me ask you a question, because I want to bring up another point that I learned from from several of these 14 conversations. But I remember, Vadim, you had an interview. You interviewed on a panel at a higher education conference this woman who's a venture capitalist. And we were asking her questions about maybe some of the concerns she has about entry-level talent these days, and how they might use some of these systems, right? Do you remember what she said? If you don't, I'll give you a hint. But do you remember what she said about some of the concerns about how some of the newer, younger people entering the workforce are using tools like ChatGPT and other AI tools at work?
Yeah, well, I think this is a cautionary tale about just not regurgitating what ChatGPT says and doing surface level work. But she said that, she would give an assignment to one of her interns, or maybe just an associate, junior associate within the company, and they would basically go to ChatGPT, ask it the same question, and then copy and paste the whole output and give it to her, which ended up being, surprise, completely useless. No thought put into even manipulating the discussion with ChatGPT to go deeper into the solution, and certainly no thought going into how one would solve the problem to dissect the most valuable parts of that advice. Because remember, a lot of these technologies give you so much content and information to work with that it actually dilutes the value. And certainly might not be directly relevant to what the actual problem at hand needs to be. So again, going a step further, and yes, leveraging these tools to make your job easier, to make your research more sound, but then also digging deeper, right? Finding other content online, not just something that ChatGPT put together, or even going deeper and looking in the reference materials that ChatGPT is surfacing to you to see, well, where is it getting this? How is it deducing this information? And then making sure that it's actually getting towards a relevant response. And more importantly, then following up with your boss or whoever gave you the assignment to not only having tested a solution, but also distilled it into very clear next steps, in terms of what one needs to do to get towards that solution. Again, copying and pasting anybody can do. It is useless. And by the way, as this technology gets integrated more into our workflows, where it's not just a chat experience, but it's reacting to what we're doing, it's going to become completely obsolete and unnecessary to do that work.
Yeah, so that is exactly what a few other folks told me. And this is actually, I was asking questions of CEOs and how they're using these tools themselves. And, one of the things I heard a couple times is, yeah, actually, the output on the surface level looks pretty good. Sometimes, right? And even if you're building, for example, certain agentic systems to solve a workflow, it looks like it might be working. And then a lot of people have told me that they're disappointed when they dig a little deeper and see the results are not there, or they're just plain wrong. So if you're experienced, you probably have a pretty good radar for what sounds like fluff, BS, AI slop, is that what people call it too now? And what is plain wrong. But if you're a little bit earlier in your career, you might not even notice that what it's giving you is wrong or very surface level. So it does require for you to dig a little bit deeper so that AI can actually make you look good in front of your boss and actually solve the problem versus just scratching at the surface. So I did hear that a couple times, so something to look out for.
All right, so one other thing I want us to touch on that this particular leader mentioned, and I think it speaks to how other leaders and founders and are thinking as well. And she said that everyone's going to have a revenue goal now. And I do think that, we hire people all the time, and when we're looking at resumes, it's just either that it is optimized for an ATS system and not really a human to see it, so all the resumes look the same, or more importantly, they over-index on using numbers or data or quantifying their experience without actually connecting it to what they did in that role. And look, in the end of the day, organizations, if they're going to be hiring you, for better or worse, they're looking for efficiencies, but they want to make sure, hey, if I'm spending $100,000 on this person, am I getting back 200, 300, 500? Or am I spending $100,000 and I'm losing money on this person because they're not efficient enough, right? So what do you think she meant by everyone's going to have a revenue goal? Obviously, not everyone's going to be in a GTM or a sales role or a marketing role. Not everyone's going to be responsible for revenue. So how can someone think about how their work relates to ROI, return on investment for the organization?
And I think this is, to some extent, this has always been the case. If I'm hiring somebody, they should be more valuable than what I'm paying for them. But AI is making it more acutely visible because almost every company, and part of it is the social pressure, honestly, unfortunately, but almost every company is trying to create more efficiency, or at least the board is telling the CEO, you need to be more efficient. How are you using AI to be more efficient? And so as a result, unfortunately, they are trying to squeeze out of every employee, squeeze a little bit more out of every employee. But more importantly, every manager or VP now has to prove to their CEO that they are paying attention to efficiency and the people are paying for themselves. So that means that you are either creating processes, automations, whatever it might be in terms of a toolkit, and the workflows that you're trying to make work to do more with your job, to make your job more efficient, to cut costs, or you're creating automations and hacks, if you will, to drive more leads, to drive more revenue, to hire people faster, whatever your role is, how it defines more, how it's related more to the actual top line. So either top line, revenue, or bottom line, profitability, meaning efficiency from every single process that you have and every human that you have, is just more visible now with these tools.
Great. So I do think that the opportunity right now, even though it may seem bleak for folks, where you're hearing news about inflation, you're hearing news about rising costs of living, you're hearing news about AI creating efficiency and really reducing the need for humans. You're hearing Anthropic CEO say somehow 20% of people, entry-level jobs are going to go away. There's 9% of unemployment among entry-level talent already. We're not saying these things aren't true. But what is true is that anytime there is new innovation or technological innovation that enters the market, you do have a period of a dip, if you will, in terms of demand for talent. Like, as markets figure out, what role does this technology play? And so there is going to be an adjustment in terms of how talent is going to essentially have to show up to show value within these organizations, right? Whether you're joining a big company or you're joining an early stage team as an operator. But the good news is, from what we're hearing, not much has actually changed in terms of how somebody shows value and delivers on their value for somebody else, which is essentially how one gets opportunities, is can you deliver on a particular area of value or not, simply put.
So hopefully this conversation has made you feel a little bit better about the reality in the world today and what you're going to be up to this week. Hopefully you got a little bit more clarity on just focusing on getting good at whatever it is that you're doing. And if you're not subscribed to the show yet, please do subscribe, because Vadim and I are talking to CEOs, to deans and presidents of universities, to regular folks like you and I who are working in companies every day and trying to make sure we're competitive. And so we're going to be bringing these insights to you of what's actually happening in the market, in industry, inside these organizations, and how we can adapt to make sure that we can survive in the world that is coming at us very quickly. Technology is changing every single day, and it's changing the reality of the workforce every single day. But the news is designed to overhype a little bit, and the stuff that you see surfaced on Reddit, on LinkedIn, on TikTok is designed to get an emotion out of you. And so we'll probably come up with a title for this episode that also gets an emotion out of you so that you all listen. But in the end of the day, we'll give you the reality. We're not going to sugarcoat it, but we're also not going to hype it up so that you can see what's actually going on.
So again, get off social media, reframe your thinking for the week, and get busy actually solving problems and working on things that interest you. Thanks so much for your time. This is The Mentors. I'm Vadim.
And I'm Sergey.
And we'll be back soon with another episode.
Bye-bye.